A few months ago, my friends and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. I was the only girl in the group. My boyfriend, Mark, and our friends, Andrew and Brian, were all hyped about the trip. I was excited too, even though the idea of staying somewhere so remote kinda gave me the creeps. The cabin was in a region known for its unique culture, and none of us really knew much about it. The drive there was intense. Hours of rough, bumpy dirt roads surrounded by thick trees that seemed to swallow up the sky. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures online. Small, dark wooden walls, and a cozy little porch. The isolation was insane. No cell signal, no noise, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. At first, the quiet felt peaceful, like a break from the chaos of daily life. But that changed pretty quickly when we started exploring the area. While gathering firewood, we noticed old, burnt-out fire pits and these weird symbols made of twigs hanging from the trees. It was unsettling, but Brian shrugged it off, saying it was probably the work of campers or hunters. We tried not to overthink it. That night, after a simple dinner and a few beers, we decided to call it an early night. The long drive had drained us, and the quiet of the forest felt perfect for sleeping. I was just about to drift off when I heard something that made me freeze, chanting. At first I thought it was just the wind or some animal sounds, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too human. I stayed still, straining to hear more, and then Mark whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my heart racing. The voices were distant but clear enough to send chills down my spine. Andrew and Brian must have heard it too, because they came to our room, whispering about checking it out. I wanted to stay locked inside, but they were already putting on their shoes and grabbing flashlights. As much as I hated the idea, I followed them. I wasn't about to be left alone in the cabin. We crept out, keeping low and trying not to make any noise, heading toward the direction of the chanting. The closer we got, the louder and more haunting it became. Finally, our flashlights hit an open clearing, and what we saw there will stick with me forever. The clearing was lit up by torches stuck into the ground, and in the middle, there was a group of people wearing these heavy-looking dark robes. They were standing in a circle, each holding something shiny that reflected the torchlight. But the creepiest part was what was at the center of the circle, a sort of makeshift altar with red symbols painted on it. I couldn't tell if it was paint or something else, and honestly, I didn't want to know. The chanting was louder now, almost deafening, and it was paired with these slow, synchronized movements. My brain was scrambling to make sense of it, but nothing about it seemed normal. We crouched behind the trees, trying to stay hidden while we watched. My skin was crawling, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. Then it happened. Brian, who was squatting next to me, lost his balance and stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed through the silence, cutting right through the chanting. My heart dropped as the group suddenly froze and turned their heads toward us all at once. We didn't move, barely even breathed, but it didn't matter. One of them pointed in our direction, and just like that, the entire group started walking toward us. Fast. Pure panic took over. We bolted, running blindly through the trees, the ground uneven and slippery with leaves. The forest that had seemed so still earlier now felt like it was closing in on us. Behind us, we could hear the sound of branches snapping and feet pounding against the dirt. They were chasing us, and they were fast. Way faster than I thought anyone could move in the dark. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me forward when I started to slow down. My lungs were burning, but stopping wasn't an option. We just ran, praying we'd make it back to the cabin before they caught up. When the cabin finally came into view, I almost cried from relief. We stumbled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it as fast as we could. All the lights were turned off, and we huddled together in the dark, listening. At first, it was just silence, broken only by our own heavy breathing. Then we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto Mark's arm. Someone tried the doorknob, turning it ever so gently, like they were testing to see if it was locked. I felt like I was going to pass out from fear. Things only got worse from there. The footsteps outside stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe they had left. But then, we heard it, a scratching sound on the side of the cabin, like someone was dragging something sharp across the wood. It wasn't random either. It was slow, deliberate, and went on for what felt like forever. Brian whispered to Andrew that we should make a run for the car, but the idea of leaving the cabin and running through the dark felt like a death sentence. Still, staying there wasn't exactly a safe bet either. We didn't have much of a choice. Mark grabbed the doorknob and threw the door open suddenly, and we all bolted out. The cold night air hit me like a slap as we sprinted toward the car, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead. The car was only a few meters away, but the darkness made it feel like miles. Just as we got close, I saw something, or someone, dart past the car on the other side. They were trying to cut us off. Andrew fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that it felt like forever before he finally unlocked the doors. We all piled in, slamming the doors behind us. Andrew started the engine, and for a moment, it felt like the longest few seconds of my life. When the car finally roared to life, he floored it. The tires kicked up dirt as we sped down the uneven road, bouncing around in our seats. I glanced out the back window and nearly screamed. Figures were running through the trees, keeping up with us longer than any human should have been able to. Their silhouettes flickered in and out of the headlights as we swerved around potholes and tree roots. It was like something out of a nightmare. Finally, we hit the main road, and just like that, everything stopped. The figures disappeared, and the forest went silent again. No one said a word the rest of the drive. We didn't stop until we reached a cheap motel in the nearest town, where we locked ourselves inside and stayed up all night, too shaken to sleep. Even now, I don't know what we stumbled into or who those people were. I just know I'm never going anywhere that remote again. Sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I swear I can still hear that chanting, and it sends chills down my spine every time. Since I was a kid, my dad used to take me fishing, and camping was always my way to escape the chaos of the city. I'm 28 now, and recently, my buddy Lucas suggested we try something different, camping and fishing by a remote river, far from everything. It sounded like the perfect idea to unwind. We packed up my car and drove about 3 hours to this isolated spot where the only sounds were the trees swaying and the water running. We got there late in the afternoon, set up our tent near the riverbank, and got our inflatable boat ready for some night fishing. The night fell quickly, as it does in places like this, and the stars were so bright we turned off our flashlights to enjoy the sky. The vibe was peaceful. All we could hear were the crickets and the gentle lapping of the water against the boat. We anchored near a deeper part of the river, our fishing rods ready, chatting about random stuff while waiting for a bite. That's when we heard the first strange noise, a light movement in the water like something big just passed near the surface. At first we thought it was a huge fish, and honestly we got excited. Lucas leaned over the side of the boat, shining his flashlight, but all we could see was the dark, calm water. Still, there was this eerie feeling like something was different. For a moment, everything went silent, even the crickets stopped. Then it happened again. The water beside the boat moved, slow but heavy, like something massive was gliding just below us. My heart started racing, but I nervously joked that maybe it was a giant catfish or a stingray. Lucas laughed, but I could tell he was just as uneasy. Suddenly, the boat jerked violently, like something had rammed into it on purpose. We looked at each other, confused and scared. Before we could react, we heard this guttural, low-pitched sound coming from the water, like a growl mixed with a hiss. Nothing like I'd ever heard before. That's when I realized it wasn't a fish. Lucas dropped his fishing rod and grabbed the paddle, trying to steer us away, but it was too late. Something enormous broke the surface, moving so fast it almost flipped the boat. What I saw in that moment didn't feel real. It looked like a massive crocodile, but its proportions were all wrong. Its skin was dark and slimy, almost like it was covered in moss or algae. I couldn't make out all the details, but its eyes reflected the light from the flashlight with this eerie yellow glow. It came up right next to the boat, and the force of its movement nearly knocked us into the water. Lucas screamed, and I froze for a second. completely unsure of what to do. Everything was happening so fast that I couldn't process it. Before I knew it, Lucas lost his balance and fell into the water. The sound of his body hitting the river was terrifying, and my brain just went into full panic mode. He tried to scream, but he was already splashing around, struggling to keep his head above water. I leaned over the side to grab him, but every time I moved, the boat felt like it was going to tip over. And then I saw it again. That thing was circling him, moving so smoothly and quickly through the water it made my stomach drop. I reached out my hand, screaming his name, desperate to pull him back in. Lucas grabbed onto my hand with so much force that it almost yanked me into the river with him, but I held on. The problem was, he was slippery and heavy from the water, and I felt like I was losing grip. While I was pulling with everything I had, the creature came closer. I could see its massive body cutting through the water like a shadow. It was fast, way too fast for anything I'd ever seen. That awful growl came again, muffled under the water, and I swear it felt like it was toying with us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, I managed to haul Lucas close enough for him to grab onto the side of the boat. Just when I thought we were safe, the creature slammed into the boat again, harder this time. The inflatable started to give way. I could hear the air hissing out. One of the paddles fell into the water, and the boat began to spin slightly, throwing us completely off balance. My head was spinning too. All I could think about was getting Lucas out of the water and finding a way to the shore before it got to us again. I managed to pull Lucas back into the boat, but he was shaking all over, completely drenched and panicking. Without thinking, I grabbed the one paddle we had left and started rowing like a madman toward the shore. The sound of the water behind us was deafening, like that thing was chasing us and getting closer with every second. The boat was deflating fast, and every time I paddled, I felt like we were sinking more. Lucas was trying to help, but he was so exhausted he could barely move, let alone do anything useful. When we finally saw the shoreline, it felt like a tiny glimmer of hope. But just as we thought we were getting closer, that growl came again, louder this time, and the boat lurched violently. I don't even know how we didn't capsize, but at that moment, the boat started going under for real. We had no choice. I yelled at Lucas to jump, and we both threw ourselves into the freezing water, swimming as fast as we could. The cold hit me like a punch to the chest, and every stroke felt like I was moving in slow motion. We dragged ourselves onto the shore, completely out of breath, collapsing onto the muddy ground. My lungs were burning and my whole body felt heavy from the water soaking my clothes. I turned to look at the river, and even in the early morning light, I could see something moving just below the surface. It wasn't over. That thing was still there, circling, like it was waiting for us to come back. Lucas and I didn't say a word. We just grabbed whatever we could carry and ran toward the campsite. Back at the tent, we sat there shaking, holding a fishing knife and a thick branch like those were going to protect us. The forest, which had seemed peaceful earlier, now felt suffocatingly quiet. Every rustle in the bushes or crack of a twig made my heart jump. Neither of us could sleep. We stayed up the rest of the night, terrified, until the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees. When the sun finally came up, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. Everything felt calmer in the daylight, but the river that had seemed so inviting the day before now felt menacing. We didn't waste any time. We packed up what little we could carry and left the rest behind. The boat was destroyed, half sunken near the shore, and there was no way we were going back to retrieve it. We didn't even talk about what had happened. We just started walking, following the trail back to the car. Even now, I can't make sense of what we saw that night. I've spent hours researching animals in that region, but nothing matches what we experienced. The sounds, the sheer size, the way it moved. It doesn't fit with anything that should have been in that river. Lucas avoids the topic altogether, like ignoring it might somehow erase it from his memory. But I can't forget. The image of that thing, those glowing eyes, and the way it felt like it was hunting us still haunts me. Every time someone invites me to go camping or fishing, I can't help but think back to that night. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, like we'd crossed into something's territory and barely made it out alive. Since then, I've sworn to myself, no more remote rivers, no more camping in the middle of nowhere. Some places just aren't meant to be disturbed. I've been a railway engineer for nearly a decade, and I've seen it all in this job. Rotting tracks in the middle of nowhere, tunnels full of bats, and train stations abandoned for decades. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened at the old St. Clair station. I was sent there to do an initial inspection because the government was funding a revitalization project. It was one of those places frozen in time, worn-out wood, cracked walls, and an oppressive silence. I got there early, around 8 a.m., with my toolkit, clipboard, and a radio that barely worked in remote areas. The day started like any other. I spent the morning walking along the platform, taking pictures and measuring the structure. The smell of mold was unbearable, and the floor creaked with every step. While inspecting, I noticed some things that made me uneasy. There was an old, filthy mattress shoved into a corner of the waiting room, surrounded by scattered food wrappers. The weirdest part was a broken phone, its screen shattered, lying on the mattress. I figured it might belong to a drifter or someone passing through, but there wasn't a single soul around. I jotted it down in my notes and tried to focus on my work, ignoring the nagging feeling that something was off. As the day went on, the weather started to change. The clouds rolled in, covering the sun and making the place feel even more eerie. The station felt bigger inside than it looked from the outside, with dark hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept working on my measurements, but that feeling of being watched kept growing stronger. I turned around several times, convinced I'd see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just shadows and that overwhelming silence, broken only by the sound of the wind through broken windows. When I was about done, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps echoing on the wooden floor somewhere inside the station. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound continued, growing louder. I grabbed my flashlight and called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. I decided to head to the main entrance where my car was parked, but when I got there, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The iron gate was locked. I had left it open. At that moment, panic started to creep in. I tried pulling the gate open, but the padlock was firmly secured. Who could have locked it? I looked around, but everything seemed calm, like nothing had happened. I grabbed my phone to call the office, but there was no signal, no surprise in a place this remote. I decided to head back inside the station to look for another way out, or maybe something I could use to break the lock. Every step felt heavier, like my instincts were screaming at me not to go back in. As I crossed the platform, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were closer. I turned off my flashlight, trying not to make any noise. Then, I saw something that made me freeze. A dark figure moving slowly at the end of the hallway. They were crouched down, almost crawling, as if trying to stay hidden. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I couldn't move for a few seconds, but I knew I had to get out of there. Whoever they were, they weren't friendly. Holding my flashlight tightly, I started moving backward, trying not to make the floor creak. The figure stayed still, crouched at the far end of the corridor, but then I noticed something even more unsettling. They were looking right at me. I couldn't make out their face in the darkness, but their outline was fixed on me like they knew exactly where I was. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew I had to act fast. Without thinking twice, I ran toward the ticket counter area, where I had seen a broken window earlier. The problem was, when I got there, I realized the window was too small for me to climb through. Desperation started to take over. As I frantically searched for another exit, I heard footsteps speeding up behind me, like they were chasing me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled around for something I could use to defend myself. The only thing I found was a piece of wood, old and brittle. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. With the piece of wood in hand, I ran out to the platform, hoping I could climb over the gate. The problem was, the platform was surrounded by tall metal fences, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to scale them without making noise. As soon as I stepped onto the platform, the floorboards creaked behind me, followed by heavy footsteps. It was clear now. The person wasn't hiding anymore. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figure stepping through the doorway onto the platform. There was no time to think. I started running. I reached the end of the platform and tried climbing the iron gate with everything I had. The wooden boards beneath me wobbled, threatening to give way. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, and when I turned, I saw the figure standing just a few feet away. I couldn't see their face in the darkness, but they were holding something in their hand. A metal rod, or maybe a pipe. My stomach sank as I realized how close they were. This was it. I gripped the piece of wood tighter, bracing myself for whatever was coming. I swung the wood as hard as I could when they lunged toward me, hitting them somewhere. Maybe their arm or whatever they were holding. The impact made them stumble backward, giving me just enough time to scramble up the gate. My heart was racing, my arms burning as I pulled myself over the top. I jumped down to the gravel on the other side, landing hard but not caring about the pain. When I turned back to look at the platform, it was empty. The figure was gone, like they had disappeared into thin air. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I ran straight to my car, jumped in, and drove off as fast as I could, leaving that cursed station behind. To this day, I have no idea who or what was there with me that night. But one thing's for sure. I'm never going back to St. Clair. My best friend Clara and I have always been obsessed with photography, especially when it comes to exploring isolated, forgotten places. We're the type of people who believe the best shots come from the most unexpected moments. That's how we ended up at an old abandoned farm about 10 miles outside of town. It was a sunny Saturday, and everything seemed perfect. Clear skies, the smell of damp earth, and the distant chirping of birds you'd never hear in the city. We parked near a rundown barn and spent hours capturing the overgrown vegetation and a few animals brave enough to show themselves. As we wandered around, something about the place started to feel off. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but the silence there didn't seem normal. The birds that were chirping earlier had gone quiet, and the only sounds were our footsteps crunching through the tall grass. After a while, Clara pointed to the ground near the barn entrance. Fresh footprints. They weren't ours. They were bigger, like boot prints, and the pattern circled around the barn. We laughed it off, thinking maybe someone else had come by to explore, but the fact that they looked so recent made me uneasy. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to feel like something wasn't right. We tried to shake it off and keep exploring. Clara suggested we check out a small wooded area near the main house, where she thought she saw an owl perched on a tree. I was hesitant but didn't want to seem paranoid, so I agreed. As we walked, we started hearing noises, footsteps that didn't belong to us. They were quick, like someone running through the woods, but they would stop every time we did. Clara and I exchanged a look, and I could tell she heard it too, even though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. "Probably just an animal," she whispered, but I wasn't so sure. When we finally headed back to the car, all we wanted was to leave as fast as possible. We were sweaty, dirty, and had this awful feeling that we weren't alone. That's when I saw it. The car's tires were completely slashed, all 4 of them. My stomach dropped, and Clara started to panic, frantically checking her phone for service. But there was nothing, not even a single bar. The worst part? The same boot prints we saw earlier were now all around the car. Someone had been there, and not long ago. My first instinct was to get inside the car and lock the doors, but that didn't make much sense with the tires ruined. Clara, on the other hand, started pacing in circles, looking around as if she could spot whoever did this. "We need to get out of here now," she said, her voice shaking. I glanced at the dirt road we had driven in on and knew that, even on foot, it would be nearly impossible to make it back to town before dark. I tried to stay calm, but deep down, I had no idea what to do. The silence around us was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding so loudly I was sure anything out there could hear it too. Then we heard it. Footsteps. This time, not from the woods, but on the dry dirt near the barn. Someone was coming. I grabbed Clara's arm and whispered for her to get in the car. We slammed the doors shut, crouching down low in the seats, barely breathing. Through the small gap in the window, I saw him. Or at least, I think it was a man. He stood with his back to us, right in front of the barn, wearing a filthy shirt and heavy boots. He didn't move, but I knew he was aware of us. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity before he finally started walking. Slowly, deliberately, like he wanted us to know he was in control. He made his way toward the car, dragging his hand along the side, scratching the metal with what looked like a blade. Clara let out a small sob, and the man stopped in his tracks. He knew exactly where we were. Then, he started walking again, this time circling the car. We could hear his boots crunching the dirt, and eventually, he disappeared from sight behind the back of the car. The tension was unbearable. I waited for the sound of his footsteps to fade, but they didn't. It was like he had vanished. I forced myself to peek through the rearview mirror, but there was no one there. Everything was too quiet. "Did he leave?" Clara whispered, tears running down her face. Before I could answer, a sharp, rhythmic tapping sound came from the back window. That's when it hit me. He never left. He was still there, messing with us, waiting for us to make the next move. Both of us were panicking, but we were trying our best to keep it together. I pulled out my phone again, even though I knew there was no signal, and started tapping the screen out of sheer desperation. The tapping on the back window continued, steady and deliberate, like he was reminding us he wasn't going anywhere. Clara grabbed my arm and whispered, "We have to run." The thought of leaving the car was terrifying, but staying felt like a death trap. I scanned the area for any possible escape route. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, but it seemed like trading one nightmare for another. Somehow, we worked up the courage to make a run for it. We counted to 3, flung the car doors open, and bolted in the opposite direction of where we last saw him. I don't know how I managed to move so fast, with my heart practically exploding out of my chest. We ran aimlessly, hearing only the sound of our own footsteps and branches snapping beneath our feet. But then, we heard something else. Heavy, fast footsteps behind us. They were closing in. Clara tripped and fell, and in that split second, I felt certain we were done for. I yanked her up as quickly as I could, and we kept running, blindly crashing through the trees. Everything looked the same. Endless trees and thick underbrush with no clear way out. All I could think was to keep going no matter what. But then the footsteps behind us suddenly stopped. It was like he just vanished. Clara and I were gasping for air, our legs barely holding us up, when we spotted a clearing up ahead. It looked like a road, or at least something that could lead us out of there. I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. When we finally made it to the road, we saw a car driving by. We waved it down frantically, and the driver stopped, staring at us like we'd lost our minds. We begged him to let us in, and without asking any questions, he unlocked the doors. I didn't look back. Not once. To this day, I don't know who that man was, or why he did what he did. But whenever I think about those boot prints and the sound of his footsteps, I get the same sinking feeling I had that day. Like he's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble onto that property. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.